Welcome back. In this session, we're going to look at issues to do with how and when assessment is done. The timing of assessment matters. And this is the framework that I'm going to use throughout this course. And it's our curriculum understanding of what assessment is about. Assessment, the three big issues in assessment are quality, the formats of assessment, and the purposes of assessment. And in the last session, we talked a bit about the purpose of assessment. And today, we're going to talk again about the purpose of assessment to do with formative and summative. And I like to talk about these things with my students in terms of the moonshot. When the Americans were planning their trip to the moon, they had to design a series of actions that would guide them in getting to the moon. And they had to have checkpoints all the way through the journey of getting to the moon and coming back alive. And in that series, they designed time points in which they would check, is everything working okay? Are we on track? And I always like to think about this in terms of how does this apply to education? In education, we have a set of targets, objectives, outcomes, goals in our teaching. And I hope that we have checkpoints where we take stock and say, where are we up to? And what do we need to do next to continue our journey towards our desired goals? And one of the important things about the moonshot is that when they're halfway between the Earth and the moon, say at shot number 3, they have to make an adjustment. And a small adjustment could be a big difference. If they burn the rockets too long in the wrong direction, they miss the moon and they don't come back. So that means the quality of their judgments has to be very high. And I sometimes wonder whether the judgments we make in the classrooms, interacting with students, needs to also have pretty high quality standards in order to advise us well as to who needs to be taught what next. And so we're going to talk more about when should you do assessment and what's the difference between the different times at the end and during the process. As I've said, in the moonshot, these assessments were frequent. Some small changes were made to get to the end point. The end judgments, have you reached the moon? Have you returned to Earth? Were very easy to make. Did you pass the final qualification exam or not? It's reasonably easy to make. But on week 3 of a 50-week course, it's hard to know what we have to do. And we need lots of data, but all of this data needs to be focused on one key question that we'll keep coming back to. Who needs to be taught what next? The goal of assessment during teaching is to tell us who needs to be taught what next, and conversely, who needs what to be not taught this next, because they already know it. And there is a debate in the assessment industry between formative and summative, and it will be clear where we stand in this matter. Michael Scriven invented the terminology of formative and summative in the 1960s, and he argued that the difference is when it takes place. Formative takes place before the end, summative takes place at the end, and both are needed, and both need to be high quality in order to make good decisions. In the 1980s, Roy Sadler came along and said, actually, qualitative is a different construct, and so a summative device like an exam or test can't really be used formatively. And then, much more recently in the Assessment for Learning, or AFL view, there is a view that says formative is only the informal interaction that happens in the classroom between the learner and the teacher. Well, I think it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that my personal position is we're going to follow the Scriven view, that we're going to use a mixture of multiple methods of collecting data to inform us during the process and as well to evaluate at the end of the process. And during the process, before we get to the end, we have the opportunity to make changes. And that's what teachers are in the classroom for. to get information back on who's learning what, to make decisions about changing things. So assessment has to tell us the current status and give us feedback during the development of our teaching so that we can make changes to our teaching. Teaching is not an activity where we plan it once and we deliver it as planned. We are interactive and dynamic as things change. And so formative assessment is all about trying to find out who needs to be taught what needs to be changed, if anything, and how to change it so we can get to the targets. Summative, on the other end, is done to establish the quality. We know the students have reached the end of the course, and we give them a final examination, and we give grades of various merit to say how well they've done. And it's about deciding how good something was now that it's over. Did we meet expectations or standards? How good is it? What merit does it have? But let's use a very famous metaphor to think about how are these formative and summative different. When a chef tastes a soup, he's tasting it to see if it meets his mental image of what a perfect soup is. And he reaches a point where he says, this soup is good enough, I want to sell my soup to my customers. The customers pick up the spoon, put it in their mouth, and they do exactly what the chef did. They taste it and decide whether or not it's delicious, average, or no, I'm sorry, please send this back to the kitchen, I don't want it. But both assessments, whether it's formative while the chef is making the soup, or summative with the customer tasting the soup, have to involve the same processes. Tasting, smelling the soup to decide its characteristics and decide its value. And that's what teachers have to do before the final exam. Monitor student learning to see if it's reaching the targets that they're after. So in contrasting formative and summative assessment, what we see is they differ in certain key characteristics. In terms of timing, formative assessment is done before it's too late, before there's nothing more we can do, while summative assessment is at the end. Typically, formative assessment involves teacher and student interactions, question and answers, observations, getting kids to do tasks and observing and evaluating them, getting the students to comment and critique each other's work, getting students to self-evaluate, even giving quizzes. These are all relatively low-stakes mechanisms for collecting data with the focus on improvement. And quite obviously, if the data from those assessment activities is not high quality, it's very difficult for those assessments to actually contribute to understanding who needs to be taught what next. Decision-making requires high-quality information. Summative, on the other hand, at the end, we often think of those as being teacher-controlled things like tests or exams, sometimes even run by external government agencies. And they're usually high stakes, for the student at least, because the student may or may not get a report or a certificate. And certainly we expect the quality of these to be high too, otherwise it's unfair who gets the certificate. But what's important to me here is that these summative events at the end of a unit, at the end of a term, at the end of a year, can become formative. If the teacher picks up the information from that test and analyzes it and says, oh, I see my class weren't good at X, then if the teacher uses that information to change his or her teaching, then that teacher is being formative. And so just because it's at the end doesn't mean it's the end. So summative testing can become formative, and just as this client, as they're tasting the soup in the restaurant, their feedback goes back to the chef, and if 80% of customers who taste the chef's special soup comment to the waiters, we don't like it and we don't want to pay for it, then that's a strong message to the chef who might be able to change his recipe and get a winning recipe. And so end of test, end of unit testing can become formative if teachers and students use it that way. But if they just file and forget, then they're not very formative at all. So the end is not always the end. Summative testing can become formative. But throughout education, the goal is to inform teaching and learning changes. How can we make it better? Who do we need to make it better for? Thank you.